First of all, I would say yes. I think strategically and practically, Israel wants to reinstate deterrence, which basically failed on October 7th because Israeli security failed to protect its people.
Welcome to the Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. Our very, very special guest today is Dr. Joshua Krug. He's an entrepreneur and a visiting professor of Jewish studies in Germany. And we're going to be discussing the events playing out in Israel at the moment. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Krug. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Wonderful to be here.
Dr. Krug, I was, very keen to have you with us because, getting somebody who's right there on the ground, as opposed to getting somebody who's slightly away from the conflict, there's a big difference in the perspective. So, which is why I thought, you would have a much more, a 36,000 feet high view of the whole thing rather than somebody who's actually involved in the whole thing. So let's start right from the beginning, I'm very curious to know that now with the world seemingly ganging up against Israel, saying that you better do this or we'll, how does Israel justify itself that, we need to do this and this is what we're going to do? What are the arguments that are being used?
Absolutely. So first of all, I would say that I'm speaking for myself as an analyst, not as an Israeli government or something like this.
Of course.
But yeah, practically, I think that it's saying, it has an obligation to return its citizens who have been taken hostage. It has an obligation to keep its citizens and people safe in the short, medium, and long term. Another thing that I'm hearing Israeli politicians and others say is that this is an existential fight for the state of Israel. So it's not really a choice. I would also note that that there are various considerations with regard to Israeli politics, the Israeli coalition that's currently ruling. And I believe that Netanyahu wants to keep his job and wants to stay out of trouble. He has some political challenges in Israel today. So I think that's another dynamic that we want to monitor.
But, when somebody comes and asks you that, how can you, for the sake of, just if you look at the numbers, how can you kill so many thousands of people for the sake of just, 250 hostages? Where is the argument in that?
Definitely. So I think that from Israel's perspective, it's not responsible for the deaths of a lot of Palestinian civilians. Hamas strategically uses civilians as human shields. So what I'd like to see, no child, no person who's not involved be killed in any war, in any military situation. I'd also like to see Hamas be held responsible and accountable for putting its neighbors' children in harm's way. So in other words, yes, Israel is dropping the bombs and killing people in that process, but how is the leadership, the authority that is the authority in Gaza, even though they've been significantly weakened, how are they what are their strategies? What are their tactics? And what's the right amount of, what's the relationship that we should have to those tactics? I would say that I want to see more pressure be put on Hamas to care for their own neighbors' children.
The interesting thing here is that a lot of people say that this is sort of Israel's 9/11, and that that you have to respond to take out the people responsible for it, otherwise they'll be encouraged to do more. But if you take that one step further, there are all these countries now suddenly recognizing Palestine, and Israel's argument seems to be that you're actually rewarding terrorism. What are your views on that?
First of all, I would say yes. I think strategically and practically, Israel wants to reinstate deterrence, which basically failed on October 7th because Israeli security failed to protect its people. So Yeah, I think that Israel has made a choice to seek to take out the authority that is currently threatening it and its well-being and its existence, and is willing to risk its popularity in that process. Yeah.
I remember you sent me an article you had written for The Atlantic, where you had argued that, war and all that, I guess, is okay, but civilians and the innocent shouldn't get hurt. And from what I understand, Israel made specific corridors for innocents to move away from the fighting zone. Do you think the Hamas was actually preventing them from moving out while all this was happening? Are there reports of that happening, that civilians were not allowed to sort of escape?
My impression is yes, that Hamas wanted and wants Palestinian civilians to be trapped in harm's way. They don't want their people to die, to be clear, but they're willing to pay a very significant price in the blood of their own neighbors' children and their own for the sake of the cause. And as someone who considers themselves a humanist, it's deeply troubling. I would just share with your audience that the argument that I made there was what does it look like to care for people who are in harm's way in these days? In Syria and in Ukraine, there were opportunities for people who were in harm's way to not be in a war zone. Very uniquely, in this particular situation, that hasn't really been on the table. Sort of that it's basically like if you're in Gaza right now, you are trapped. There's nowhere for you to go. Egypt has not allowed Palestinians to go there, and I completely understand that from a strategic and practical vantage point. Israel has not allowed Palestinian civilians to go inside the Negev in one way or another. But neither have many countries really sort of said, "Hey, people are in harm's way. We're gonna find some way for them if they want to be able to choose to no longer be in a war zone." So it's a pretty unique situation, and that relates to the history and to the sense that people have of the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So glad to expand on that as well.
No, I will come back to you on that particular thing. But one of the things that, at least it seems to me, and it was argued, and somebody else I'd interviewed earlier, is that Israel seems to have lost the war of narratives, in the sense that the Palestinians seem to have made a cause saying that, look, so many thousands of children and women and all those are being killed, and part of the reason seems to be that the media that the Palestinians are using are social media and TikTok and all these other media, whereas Israel seems to be sticking to stuff that only perhaps you and I and some policy wonks in the US read, which is New York Times and all those papers. Would that be a correct assessment?
I think there's a lot of truth to what you're noting, that Israel has relied on, you could say, the more traditional media sources, and we've seen the use of social media tools in this war, as well as disinformation campaigns that we want to keep monitoring. But I guess let's step back. What I noted before is my impression. Again, it's a war, so there's always a fog of war. Who do we trust?
That's right.
That's always a big question, and sort of when I like to think, okay, why do I trust this media source or that? What is my own basis, right? So, so practically, my impression, my sense regarding in relation to who I trust is that Hamas wants to benefit strategically, practically from the deaths of its own people, and wants to be able to say to the world, look at these people that Israel is killing, right? And they want to be able to say they're a pariah state, they're horrible, and they want to benefit, as it were, because their dream is, you could say, the conquest of the entire land. And so I think that's where we're sitting, really on that practical level. My concern is a couple things. I want to see coexistence in this region. I want to see people as well as countries get along and learn not to kill each other. Again, that may seem very naive, especially in this current reality. But the question I ask I ask is, how can we get there? How can we get to that place? What is the way that we should be thinking about and, like helping or enabling people to be able to live side by side and countries, right? I think that needs to be kind of the strategic goal for all of us. Kind of what does it look like to try to enable the safety and well-being of people, especially civilians? I can say, I mean, I don't note it because, I want to say, like, Israel's own, people living in the north of Israel near Lebanon and people living in the Gaza envelope have not been able to return to their own homes to live where they live for the last several months. They are displaced. This is a way that Israel as a country has said, we want to take you out. We want to take you away from the war zone, away from the missiles in order to protect you. I'd like to see in all the world, in every situation, care and concern for people who are in harm's way. I don't want anyone to be displaced, all the more in light of the history of this conflict and the trauma that displacement causes people, right? But to me, human well-being and life is the most important value. So how, as a society, as citizens, how can we enable coexistence?
Right, I understand that. But post this, we were talking about narratives. Post this narrative, you as a Jew yourself, have you seen a rise in sort of anti-Jew sentiments anywhere? I mean, do you think that is, growing because of this war?
That's an important question. That's an important question. I would say that, unfortunately, yes, I see a significant rise in anti-Semitism. I also think it's very important to note anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Israelism are three different things, and they're related.
I was about to ask you that.
They're deeply related, and we want to be intentional about each, right? But absolutely, I've seen the word. I think now, in contrast to many moments in my own life, the word Zionist, I think, has gotten a bad reputation in certain environments, right?
Right.
Would you say to it's just I think so. We want to monitor this matter, and but practically speaking, yes. Here where I live in Germany, there was going to be an attack on the local synagogue, our one synagogue, just the other day. I'm glad to share that the police stopped the attack before it was going to happen. This is happening. This kind of phenomenon is happening really across the world today. So, so that has, I would say that is linked to this broader situation. I believe that Hamas, after October 7th, called for the Friday after, or a day there soon after October 7th, called for it to be, I believe it was a day of rage to attack Jewish sites.
Right.
So I mean, there's a broader campaign to cause challenges to Jewish people and Jewish communities, and of course, Israel is a country like any other and is capable of doing harm and making poor choices, or choices that are not right. And so we want to be able to hold both those things, and to be intentional about both those things. I don't want to be blamed as a Jew for the actions of the one and only Jewish state, just as I imagine you as someone from India don't want to be blamed or held accountable for the actions of your state. You're not making those decisions. You're a citizen, and I'm not even like a citizen of Israel. So, anyhow, there's a lot here. Glad to share more about it.
But what I find slightly more disturbing is the fact that it's the younger people who seem to be, getting involved in this in a big way. The students and all these people, and getting them to change their minds becomes even more difficult because they tend to think as a group. Have you noticed that?
Yes, I have, and that's an important phenomenon, that there's this generational component in activism in relation to this Israel-Hamas war, as it's often called. I think that relates to a few things. One, I mean, I hesitate to bring such an example in, but I think, the memory of the Holocaust is farther back in the past, and there's less awareness of that. Two, and this is very important, younger people have more digital fluency. They're digital natives. They live on TikTok and Instagram and other social media platforms. So they're engaging with these images and these narratives in a much more serious way, an engaged way. I also think related to that, they haven't necessarily been trained on, you could say, social media literacy and disinformation and how to relate to knowledge, how to relate to the world of ideas. And this may be the most important point. We all have to take awareness of, I would say, a failure of the broader of us all, because many people have died. Many, children have died, Palestinian as well as Israeli, right? That's what we're sitting with as we engage with this situation, with this conflict, and I mean, I dream of a world in which we all cannot have wars and where we can actually care about protecting each other's children. Unfortunately, we're not there yet. I'd like to see us get there. I'd like to see all of our, institutions really take action to protect our most vulnerable. But in any event, I want to honor a desire for a sense of protection of those who are vulnerable. And I think that is a really important, what's the word I'm looking for? Aspiration, inspiration, care.
Absolutely.
That we, so in other words, my question would be, yes, how can we coexist? How can we enable each other's children to not be in harm's way? How can we live together and hopefully flourish, but at the very least tolerate one another?
A friend of mine, his son had just come down from Israel. You have that conscription, and then after that, you get some money. So they tend to come to India. A lot of them tend to come to India to generally party. So I was talking to him, and he said that one of the things that he was bothered about was that, well, I wouldn't say he was bothered. He pointed out, he said, what is actually happening is that the Americans and the British and all these guys, for their own public consumption, domestic consumption, they're criticizing Israel. But to Israel, they're with a wink and a nod saying, yeah, go ahead and finish them. Here's more weapons for you. Finish these guys because they're like bad people, the Hamas, basically. So is that something that's, you think, happening actually?
Yeah, again, I'm merely a citizen here, so I don't have any
Absolutely,
special
I know. But
practically, that's my impression of what's happening.
How else can you explain it? I mean, I'm giving you weapons, and at the same time, I'm saying don't kill these guys. Publicly,
yes.
I'm saying that, So.
Yeah, so I think that there's various kinds of considerations. There's, you could say, the political considerations, where in democracies, many of which have elections upcoming. I know India just had an election.
Absolutely. And
so
this is a year of elections.
Indeed. And so that is a real consideration. How can political leaders who want to keep their jobs, want to stay in leadership, how can they be appealing to diverse constituencies, right? That's a major question. And then in addition, there are other kinds of considerations, strategic considerations, military considerations. What's the place of Iran amidst this broader, reality that we're in right now?
Of course.
Right. So,
of course, I think,
one of the things that's so intriguing is that Jordanian, Air Force members, right? They shot down Iranian, the Iranian attack, right? On behalf of the Israelis, right? So
absolutely,
there's a lot of organizing to, in my mind, to enable stability as much as possible in the Middle East and in these times. And what I see, and what frankly I am a little anxious about, is that there are many forces today that are actually seeking to create instability, right? So we can think also of Russia, Ukraine. There are various things happening in our world today that are troubling the kind of order that we've had. Now, has the order been just and perfect? Absolutely not. So let's be frank about that as well. But I think that the question of how we can learn to not kill each other and not attack one another, and to enable coexistence and well-being is an important one. if I may share, I think it's important to say, I'd like to see, Palestinians have a state of their own one day, right? I'd like to see them have a sense of dignity where they can, travel in their country, right? And folks who live in the West Bank or in Gaza have not been able to, leave particular areas. And that's a really important challenge, right?
Right.
So I think from Israelis' perspective, well, how can we keep ourselves safe from people who want to annihilate us, right? But in any event, the broader question is, how is this going to end? I fear that we're looking at a slow-moving train that's kind of about to crash, and I hope, in some ways it already has. I hope I'm wrong. I think it's important to be realistic about the world we live in, and I think it's important for many global actors to try to help to enable the situation to be resolved or be more stable, because I think that sometimes people who are in the midst of it, hard for them to do that for themselves, to enable that to happen.
Absolutely. The other thing is that Israel seems to be very clear that our primary thing, of course, is to get our hostages back. The second part is that we want Hamas out of the picture. Now, you can exterminate as many Hamas people as you can, but how do you kill the ideology?
Good question. So my impression, again, not having particular association with Israel or its leadership, just as a kind of citizen who cares very deeply about these issues, my impression is that they want to destroy the military capabilities of a terrorist organization that seeks to annihilate this state, right? So they would like, the ideology also to be quelled, right? And they would like to not have to face it. But kind of more important and more immediate is, how can we take the armaments, the military arms, out of the hands of people who want to come and hurt us, or that kind of a thing. So I think they're more interested in that latter question. I would also note that, historically speaking, there are really interesting examples of cases in which there were military conflicts, and then afterwards people learned to not kill each other. World War II is maybe the classic example.
Of course.
Germany and Japan were fighting a war, a very serious war, right? And in 1945, 1946, you have a shifting, with the end of the war to a new world order, and the United States really comes in with a lot of investment to enable Germany to rebuild, but also affects the ideology, the power of that ideology to no longer have that authority that it did in the years of the war. I would also note that the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda, that's a case where there's genocide, and then afterwards they are able to live alongside one another. So I guess the question is, how can we enable the people with, I would say, the deeply troubling ideologies to not have to not wield power, but for them rather to be out of power, and for there to be a different political dispensation.
The two-nation or two-state theory that people were talking about. Do you think, apart from the fact that Israel is worried that how can we have a hostile neighbor right in our backyard? Apart from that, do you think part of it also has to do with the fact that even if you were to take away their weapons, even if you were to take away their ability to strike you, militarily, you have other actors in the region who would be more than happy to supply them with weapons all over again. Right now you have the Hezbollah in Lebanon. I believe they've been firing a lot of missiles and rockets in northern Israel. I'm sure they'd be more than happy to help the Hamas out. And then, of course, the bigger player here is Iran. So, unless you approach the root of the problem, how do you sort of resolve this issue?
Definitely. I think that's right. And I would say that Iran today, in my vantage point, is a chaos actor seeking to bring chaos to the region. I think that Iran, if it had its way, would like to undermine the stability of the Jordanian regime, to be able to have another front against Israel and to expand their own geopolitical interests and strategic interests.
So I mean, it's interesting because Iran is not like, a smaller country. It's got its own resources, though of course with sanctions and everything that is an issue. Another thing, I'm not so sure whether you have, I mean, the kind of how will I say, know-how on this particular thing. Apart from the US, which is seen as Israel's biggest ally, who would you think are the biggest sort of, people that Israel depends on? I mean, would you consider India to be one of them?
I would like to answer, but in truth, I don't feel like I'm capable of doing so, but I'll do it anyway.
I thought so.
I'll do it anyway, and it's fine. I would say that Israel strategically has looked east, has looked to India and other countries to be allies, to be friends. And so I think that relationship is deeply important to Israel and to, its sense of self. So I would also say that, Europe and European countries are really important to Israel and in sort of its, sense of itself and sense of what it's doing. And I think that in the last days, in the last weeks, there have been some countries in Europe that have opted to recognize the state of Palestine. And I think that Israel has been threatened by those moves.
That's deeply disturbing, I suppose.
Indeed.
I mean, it's because now.
I think in Israel's vantage point, the way that some Israeli leaders see this, they see it as kind of rewarding terrorism, right?
Exactly, so that's what I was about to say.
Right. So October 7th happened, and now you have protests on the streets in this context and that context. And if you're gonna shift your policy precisely to recognize Palestine, as a state, that's a gift for terrorism. I think that the response might be, what's the end game here? How do we land this plane? I think that's maybe a metaphor that could be helpful. Like, and it may not be possible to land this plane. It's just, we're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It seems intractable in some ways, but how do we enable there to be, a resolution of this situation where people, surely not everyone's going to be, overjoyed about every dynamic, every element in it, but where people can live alongside one another in one way or another, right? That's my question. And so, in that vantage point, Hamas does not want to see two states. And in fact, what we're seeing from, these countries in Europe is an effort to bring a two-state solution to bear. Now, I think both of these arguments are strong and have basis, and sort of we have to wait and see what happens in the region. But I'd like to see the moderates kind of, gain secure footing and find a way to work together to pave forward a better way. And I know it sounds maybe naive, all the more so in the midst of a war. The hostages are not yet back. It just, there's so many, we're in the midst of it all. I mean, in the north of Israel right now, Hezbollah is attacking and Israel is responding. And, there's what's going on in Iraq, that there's a militant group over there. And there's, in Yemen, the Houthis, and they're interrupting the maritime trade, as you know. So how do we land the plane?
Exactly. That's the interesting thing. I think I'll use that as the headline here. But the interesting thing here is also that the argument being put forward for recognizing Palestine as a state is not that they deserve it or not that they really, that they merit it. In fact, they've been saying it officially that we're trying to use it to put pressure on Israel to stop the war in Gaza. Now, to me, that doesn't sound like a valid argument to actually go ahead and recognize somebody just to, put pressure on somebody else to stop that. What are your views on that?
I agree with you. My impression is that these are political moves in given societies to appease certain populations and demographics within those societies. People are concerned. people are concerned and even enraged that many children lie before us who shouldn't be dead. I don't want to mince words here, right? So, and people are angry. And so what I see is that some governments in Europe are responding in what I consider a strange way to that situation. I mean, I think the deeper question is, again, I feel like I'm continually sharing this, but the question is, how can we figure out how people in this region can get along? So, I think from Israeli's vantage point is with Hamas in power, it's not going to be possible. So we're doing everyone a favor by taking out, this terrorist group who, became an authoritarian regime and has not allowed democratic elections for the last since 2007, if I'm not mistaken, right? And that there are costs to war. I think that's the point of view of many Israelis vis-a-vis this war. But in any event, I think the question for all of us is, how can we enable people to get along, to not kill each other?
This is a conversation that we could probably take hours and hours to sort of, talk about, but unfortunately, we seem to be running out of time. So let me conclude by asking you that same question. If you were the pilot of this plane, how would you land it?
Wow, that is $1 million, trillion rupee job over there, right?
No, but I mean, let's say two basic things that you feel would help.
Oh,
Instead
sure.
of going into details, just,
Well,
if you did this, maybe it will help.
Yeah.
Taking out Hamas would be the first thing. I think that's important that you take Hamas out. Hamas is not I don't even think Hamas is a legitimate representative of the Palestinians, to be honest.
Yes.
From what I've heard.
Yes. I agree. I mean, again, now I'm going to speak more in terms of soft power than hard power. How would I put it? I think we have a situation where Israelis and Palestinians, many Israelis, many Palestinians do not trust one another at all. At all. They are very cynical. And that's like a kind word to say, about one another and what, leaders of the other side are saying, what people on the other side are saying. And I would say there's a dehumanization of people on the other side. These are enemies, right? They're people who hate each other. Maybe thinking maybe it's similar to Pakistanis and Indians. Maybe not. I'm just going to bring that in.
It is very much similar. It is very much similar.
So,
I mean, I can relate
you have
to
a
that.
situation where people are very, you could say, emotional and anxious because they fear for their lives. And I think the question to me is, how can leaders and people within these different communities demonstrate care for the humanity of their enemies, especially, well, I should say, of their enemies' children, if their enemies' kids, right? I think that.
But if the enemy is using those children as guards, what can you do? You don't have an option, do you? I mean,
I think you're describing the predicament that Israel finds itself in. But I guess my vantage point is, at a broader level, can more be done to enable children to be out of harm's way? Can there be a pressure campaign against Hamas in relation to those children who are being used as human shields? At present, I perceive a global pressure campaign against Israel, which has been, I would say, it's successful in some ways, but also largely unsuccessful because the war is ongoing. So it has not yet worked. So for those people who are concerned or angry about children in harm's way, perhaps what would it look like to change the strategic thinking of Hamas on the basis of them being held accountable for their choices to put their neighbors' children in harm's way? I think that would be a really interesting approach to take because I think that they're operating with a hope that Israel will be blamed for the bombs that Israel drops. But remember that Hamas is not providing safe places for Palestinians, to go that are really separate from their war, from where they're firing rockets.
Right. So let's conclude with the last thing. I mean, you just mentioned that It's that same suspicious thing. I don't trust you, you don't trust me, kind of a thing. But how is it that when you're talking about, you just mentioned keeping children safe, I suspect a lot would be eased if Hamas were to just release the hostages. If they did that, then Israel wouldn't have all that much more reason to sort of go after Hamas in many ways. Maybe they could try some other way to defang Hamas. Do you think that would help if Hamas were to tomorrow stand up and say, "Hey, look, these are the hostages, take them"?
Yeah, no,
That,
I would love to see that. I think strategically, from Hamas's vantage point, it sees itself benefiting from time, from time passing, because it hopes that Israel will be pressured more and more, and that the Palestinian hand, or I should say Hamas's hand, will be strengthened in that process. So it's saying that even as it's being I don't know, destroyed or hindered in its ability to attack Israel. But I think that Yahya Sinwar wants to extend this conflict, this situation, as long as possible, wants to keep hostages as long as possible, and to not allow Israel to have a normal existence, but to exert, to terrorize its neighbor for its own ends, for its own dreams of what they'd like to see in the region.
yeah, because Hamas has publicly gone out and said that we are too big for even the US or Netanyahu to sort of sideline us. They realize that that's the attempt being made, and they publicly said that you just can't sideline us. We have to be in the game, which makes it very difficult for Israel, I suppose.
Yeah, I understand Hamas's vantage point of not wanting to be destroyed. I completely understand on the level of, any political actor, right? I don't think you or I appreciate what they're doing or how they're doing it. It's horrid and it's wrong. But in any event, they have their own strategic ambitions and hopes, and they're playing the long game here. So
the long game would mean that the conflict wears on and a lot more innocents get hurt. Let's just hope that what you're hoping for, and what I guess a lot of people in this world are hoping for, is that it ends quickly. Hopefully, the way Israel wants, by at least defanging the Hamas, if not eliminating them. But I'm afraid we've run out of time, so we'll have to close this interview with that. And I look forward to having you again with us, probably under more peaceful times.
I certainly hope so. I certainly hope so. May your words somehow become actions, notwithstanding the unlikelihood of it all. But lovely to be in touch, to be able to speak with you today. And thank you for taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you for taking time out for us. And like I said, I look forward to having you again with us. Thank you. That was Dr. Joshua Krug talking to us about the events unfolding in Israel at the moment in his own frank and forthright manner. And as I mentioned earlier in this interview, being somebody slightly distanced from the whole conflict makes his views all that more important. I do hope you enjoyed this particular edition of The Gist, and I look forward to having you with us again the next time. Till then, this is Ramananda Sengupta signing out.